You know what I haven't done in a few months? Attacked somebody with creatures. Unfortunately, the police took my best creatures after the last time I did that, so I'm gonna have to make do with some of my favorites in Looter's Ill Core. See, this is one of my favorite cards of all time. It's an evasive threat that gives me card advantage over time, and they keep printing new ones which are all better than it. There was Shoreline Looter in Bloomborough, and now there's Norman Osborn, we've got Malcolm, just a whole bunch of great 2-drops which let me draw cards. Sadly for me, a lot of people seem not to enjoy being attacked by creatures, and they tend to play better creatures than this in order to defend themselves. So I need a plan for getting these creatures to actually connect. And the answer is pretty simple. Go all in on evasion. Blue-White Skies is a classic limited archetype. You play a bunch of cheap evasive threats, some similarly efficient interaction, and try to beat your opponent down before they're able to establish a board. This is a classic tempo deck. I'm giving up on card quality almost entirely to commit fully to efficiency. Going all in on efficiency like this gives me a sort of pseudo mana advantage. I'm spending less on my answers than they spend on their threats, and conversely, it's really hard for them to get that same sort of trade up. It also means that I don't need as many lands to function, and so I can play way fewer, which means that I'm more likely to draw gas over the course of a game. The next question is what color I want to use to add to this sort of creature core, the Looter Ill core of the deck that I want to play. Red's a classic. It gives me Moons, Blasts, and Burn, which functions both as removal as well as to give me some pretty insane reach by going straight to the dome. Green can be very similar, giving me some real undercosted threats, as well as pump spells for, again, more reach and as sort of pseudo-removal. Black, of course, gives me Hand Attack, which is possibly the most efficient removal in the game, alongside actual removal spells. But I went with White. White gives me two things: creatures which were cool in 2013 and unconditional removal. Creatures like Geist of Saint Traft and Spell Queller allow me to put on the gas, while removal like Path to Exile or Static Snare can clear pretty much anything out of the way for as long as I need to win the game. The creatures in White are especially relevant because I get access to a lot of hate bears. The two core elements of a tempo deck are threats and disruption, and getting to put them both on one card is pseudo card advantage, giving me all of the things I want in a more efficient package. That's really, really critical for how fast I'm going to burn through my hand. But let's come back to removal, because that's actually a harder question than it looks like. See, if I want to spend as little mana on my effects as possible, I'm looking at 1 mana removal, and White's best 1 mana removal actually gives a lot back to my opponent. And when my game plan comes down to single points of life, these donations can be really, really backbreaking for me. Things like life gain are especially relevant, since I've actually given up forms of reach in terms of pump spells and burn spells in order to have access to White in the first place. Fortunately, since I'm already in the business of playing bad cards, I'm happy to throw in a card like Unwanted Remake. The body that it gives back isn't actually as relevant in this deck because almost all my creatures can just attack straight past it. The real gems that I get to leverage in this deck is temporary removal. I already mentioned Static Snare, but even just unsummon effects are way, way better in this deck than in almost any other deck because of the pressure that I'm trying to put on. It's one thing to postpone an opponent's clock for a turn, but when you're the one in the driver's seat, forcing them to play the same turn multiple times in a row, or even just getting rid of a creature for 2 turns, can be enough to close the door. In a similar vein, I'm on a full suite of counterspells at 1 and 0, including a couple of Force Spikes. It only needs to hit one thing. As for points, it's all the most efficient ways to disrupt my opponents, or kill them, or to refill after I've burned through my hand in the first 2 or 3 turns. Now, I'm not going to lie, I was expecting to get paved all night, so imagine my surprise when I actually outraced my Grixis opponent in Game 1. The absolutely brutal combination of Spider-Woman and Caracas left both their Tamio and Wan Shi-Tong completely dead in the water. The start of Game 2 seemed favourable for them, but an on-curve Harbinger with a Force in reserve completely locked up the game. Turns out an unsummon is basically Doomblade if they don't have the right colors of mana to recast the creature that you bounce. Now, round 2 against Esper was a bit tighter. Game 1, I was able to trip them a bit with a turn 1 strip into Lightstall, Dorothea, and Spider-Woman again for the beatdown. Lightstall was great, by the way. I absolutely love this card, and I want to play more of it in this type of deck. I think it's perfect here. But in Game 2, their superior card quality really started to show. Kaito is an absolutely brutal card for me to deal with. It's not counterable because of ninjutsu. It's extremely difficult to remove, and it generates so much card advantage that I just couldn't overcome it in the end. Luckily for me though, or I guess unluckily for my opponent, Game 3 was ended by the worst case of flooding I have ever seen. Multiple draw threes, nothing but lands, must have been a dozen turns or more. Thanks to my deck's more smooth aerodynamic mana base, I was able to just do more stuff than them over the course of the game. It wasn't until round 3 that the weaknesses that I'd expected really actually started to cause me problems. Blue Moon is really a very similar deck to mine in a lot of ways, but red gives them way better threats at 1 and 2 mana, as well as burn for direct damage so they can have better reach to close out the game. Both decks compromise on interaction, but in different ways. White offers up resources to their opponent in order to make sure that their removal is always live, but red simply accepts a lower ceiling of effectiveness as the price of doing business. Since I'm cheaping out on literally everything, I don't get to play threats which match up well into red removal. Meanwhile, I'm getting little to no tempo advantage out of using my cheap removal on their cheap creatures, which just makes those static trade-offs feel even worse. That said, I was able to get some pressure down. Game 1 was a tight race, and I was able to disturb Dorothea onto a Looteril core. Sadly, not enough to close it out. I had them on the ropes in Game 2 as well, beating them down with Norm and using Caracas to protect him whenever they drew removal. Unfortunately for me, my opponent seems to have just been biding their time, and as soon as they hit double red, Fury came down into Pyrogoyf to close out the game. My last round was into Grixis, and it started off well with a Tamio game. My opponent really struggled for mana since they'd kept just a Swamp and a Deathrite Shaman, and I didn't need to fetch to cast my Tamio on my first turn. That kept them from using their cantrips to get more land drops, and once Tamio ticked up to ult range, it was over. Now, Game 2 was the only game that I actually drew Stifle, and since my only 2-drop was just a Looteril core, I decided to hold it and try and use that Stifle to slow my opponent down. I can't tell you how he knew, but he played around it perfectly. That's just one of the risks of Stifle. Despite how dodgeable it is, I do think it's worth playing in this kind of deck. It's the exact kind of tying your shoelaces together and running away that the deck really wants to be doing. But if your opponent sees it coming, it can trip you up more than them. So it came down to Game 3, and it was oh so close. I kept 6 and bottomed my only removal spell in Unwanted Remake, since none of the creatures left in my hand were enough to really race on their own. After snagging their Baz with a Spell Queller, I decided to go all in, casting Murktide Regent with no instants or sorceries in my graveyard. I hadn't actually drawn any yet. I was winning, and I got them down to 2, but my opponent had a turn 2 Psychic Frog, and after chipping in with it a couple of times, they drew into a Dismember. They used that to kill the Squeller, get back the Baz, and with Psychic Frog now too big to attack through, and the writing on the wall with the life gain from the Baz, I scooped it up. I'm honestly impressed by how good this deck felt to play. Yes, some of that was the gleeful cackling of when people asked to read my bad cards, like Winged Words, but I was genuinely winning games according to my game plan. This list absolutely needs better threats so that you can play fewer overall and run more interaction and specifically counter spells to protect them. And white probably isn't the best color to give you that. Although I have heard that there might be a blue-white Legends deck that crops up at some point. Alternatively, there's a legitimate case to be made for a more mid-rangey version which leans harder into white strengths as a color. Top end like Cloud Clamp and Palace Jailer give you a huge injection of cards that can help you keep the pressure on. This build would be a much bigger pivot, you'd have to be base white, but I think that that's honestly a much better use of the basic planes than what I've got going on right now. In either case, I'd really consider moving Harbinger and Back to Basics to the main. These were the best cards I could have drawn in almost every matchup I played, and having access to them in game 1 just gives you more opportunities to win games. It might be harder to do if you're base white, but honestly, I still think that moon effects are the best way to get value out of a 2-color mana base. Anyway, that's all my notes on OK Delver. If you've got any questions or you've got more suggestions about other decks I could play, then leave a comment. I'm also streaming from 6 PM on Wednesdays, so come by and say hi. Until then, good luck, have fun, and may the best wizard win.